Here we go. Howdy, everyone. Thank you for coming. Weeding, the thing we all love to hate. So as Melanie mentioned, I am a landscaper, so I spend much of my time in the gardens of various people. I do residential landscaping. Helping them. A lot of people are very busy, so they don't really have time necessarily to deal with stuff, especially in this very urban area I live in, with things like weeding and pruning and trimming. But weeding tends to be probably what I do, I would say, a good third of my time. So I was very interested in the whole concept of weeding and how to, there we go. How I can help people understand weeding a little bit better. So, what exactly are weeds? This is a really good question. So weeds really are any plant that is in the wrong place. Essentially, a weed is like an especially aggressive plant that is competing overly successfully, usually, against some of the cultivated plants, or in our case, native plants that we've put into our disturbed landscapes. So weeding is the removal of unwanted plants from a landscape or garden, anything or anywhere that it's unwanted. So just a little information about like the history of weeds, because I don't think we really think about this all that much. America was not full of lawns and a lot of the other things like, let me see, like things like St. John's wort, daisies, dandelion, crabgrass, clover, lamb's quarter, buttercups, mullein, Queen Anne's lace, plantain, deadly nightshade. I can, go on and on. None of these things were here before, the Puritans landed in America. And in fact, America really had very few indigenous weeds for the simple reason that there really wasn't much disturbed land prior to European settlement in the colonies in early parts of America. But a lot of these things were actually brought over very intentionally, things like clover and dandelion and mullein and plantain. These were all medicinal plants. And then there was, of course, crops that they brought over with them from Europe as well. So whether these weeds came here intentionally, were brought by those settlers, or accidentally, like as a little rider on your pants or on your shoe or on your jacket or something like that, weeds got here from Europe. And now, of course, with the expanding globalization, we also have things coming from all over the world. I know I live in sunny South Florida, where it's very tropical and subtropical, and we have a lot of non-native tropical plants here, many of which have become extremely weedy. So as you all, I'm sure, know. So why are weeds so unwanted? What really are their main causes? And these are things you'll all recognize. First of all, they crowd out more desirable plants, right? They make it hard for the plants you really want to get all of what they need, either whether it's light or whether it's nutrition. They're fighting for all those different things, water, all those different things. So they're fighting for those things, and that's going to affect how what we want actually grows. And then there's things like some weeds actually spread pathogens, AKA harmful germs. So that can affect the quality of crops. or it can affect the quality of your landscape plants. Also, weeds can make it hard for farmers to walk in their fields. Things like thorns and stingers and things like that can make it difficult for farmers and for homeowners, if you're in your own garden, to get around. Also, some weeds Brazilian peppers comes to mind for me, because when I was a child, my parents, we moved down to Homestead, and we were clearing our property of all the Brazilian pepper. And little did we know that I was horrifyingly allergic to it. Next morning I woke up, after a day of taking out branches and such, with my eyes closed, with my face blown up big as a balloon, because I was very, very allergic to Brazilian pepper. And many folks are, especially if you're allergic to any kinds of the things like poison ivy, poison oak, that sort of thing. Sometimes also, especially this is more concerning, like our pets maybe, or for farmers, this is more in regard to their cattle and things like that. Weeds can actually be toxic and can cause sickness or death if eaten. That's very much a problem. And most farmers who have large grazing areas have to be very careful about what kinds of weeds they have in their fields, so they don't, kill their cattle, which would really not be very good, obviously. And finally, and probably for most of us, the most important reason is that most of the time weeds just really don't look good. I mean, if they're overwhelming everything else, or if it's an ugly weed, then clearly we want it out of our gardens, especially if they're more cultivated than not. So having talked a little bit about these weeds, what really is the cost of weeding? We can think about it from many levels. I mean, I charge my clients by the hour to weed their yards. So it can be expensive. But it's different for residential people, for commercial organizations, for government. Public spaces and parks especially have issues with very invasive non-native species coming in and destroying habitat, leading to many environmental costs. And then of course the health costs, because a lot of these places, if you're trying to control vast areas of invasive species, you're using a lot of chemicals. Most of it's not done by hand. It is done by chemicals, things like Roundup and various other chemicals that kill plants. And clearly that's going to be a health cost both to people, to animals, and to the plants themselves in the surrounding areas. And who do you think pays for all that stuff? Us. We get to pay for all that stuff. So really, this is just a little taste of what it has cost just in Florida. This particular thing here is about public clearing and treating invasive species in public waterways in the state of Florida. This is 2015-16. That's nearly $18 million to only treat 65,000 acres. That is not the whole of the state of Florida. That's just 65,000 acres in Florida. So you can see this is quite expensive. Now here's a little bit of this is from 2010 and 11. This is for upland projects, and removing invasive weeds from only 95,000 acres of land cost nearly $7 million. And we're all taxpayers here, so that means that's money is coming out of our pockets. Just a few little weed fun facts. Almost 1 in every 7 introduced non-native species into the state of Florida becomes invasive. 1 in every 7 non-native species. That's a lot. That's a lot. Also, there's definitely a very interesting perspective on perceptions. Florida's have very interesting perceptions on invasive species, and this was borne out for me when I was at a state park here in Broward County, and the park had just removed a whole bunch of Australian pines, you know, the ones that have the little cones that have, when you walk on them towards the beach, they like stick to your feet. They're not very comfortable. They're from Australia, obviously. So, but they had been there for so long, the local population was a little bit upset. They had ripped out all of these non-native trees, not really understanding that they were actually an invasive species. And by removing them, we were able to actually then plant things like sea grape and cabbage palms and beach grasses and beach plants and other kinds of things like that, that were being overrun by all the non-native Australian pines. So really educating the public on what invasive species are is a big fun fact that we need to deal with, definitely, and encourage folks to be okay with letting go of those non-native species. Damage, loss, and control cost across the United States was something in the region of $120 billion for each year. That's a lot of money, and that's a lot of tax dollars. In Florida, there's over 1,100, almost 1,200 species of non-native plant species that become established outside of cultivation. So that means, like, if a bird eats the seeds from a plant that you just bought that's not native in your yard and then poops it in a, say, a park or a natural area, and then it starts taking over. Good example of that is like Schefflera down here. I'm not sure about up your way, but Schefflera down here is definitely something that's, the birds like the seeds, they poop them around. Brazilian pepper is another good one, of course. So these are the kinds of things that, fun facts about weeds, bad weeds. And then here, some of the most abundant and widespread and harmful invasive species in Florida include things like, as I said, Brazilian pepper, melaleuca, hydrilla, which is a water plant, Chinese tallow tree, cane toad, Congan grass, Japanese climbing fern. That's a big, huge problem, definitely in Central Florida, I know. China berry, and then things like water hyacinth, which are also water plants. And then there's a few things like Burmese pythons and things like that are also causing lots of not only predation on native animal species, but also are destroying habitat as well. So, types of weeds. So I'm sure you will recognize some of these things. That beautiful little dayflower, which is so pretty with its little blue flower and takes over as a carpet wherever it goes. Sansevieria, or mother-in-law's tongue. I'm sure you all know what that is. Don't ever plant that outside. Brazilian pepper. Down here we have carrot wood. You can see here there's a picture of something called shoe button ardisia, and that it looks so similar to marlberry. They're both ardisias, but one of them is a very invasive non-native species that comes, I think, from China, and has taken over a couple of areas, acres, in fact, of Broward County parks down here. I'm not sure how far north up it goes. We also have something called Suriname cherry, which has yummy little cherries, but the birds also think they're yummy and they poop them everywhere. And it, as its name, it's a Eugenia from South America. from sternum, obviously. And then purple showers, which is the rumelia that we all see all over the place. I know that one grows up your guys' way. And that thing, oh, getting rid of that is just impossible because it sends out little rhizomes under the ground. And no matter how much you pull and pull and pull, it's almost impossible to get rid of. But there are also native plants that can be a little bit weedy in our gardens. And I'm sure we all, have experienced this, especially when you're dealing with, and if you have a house and you have property with land, it has been disturbed. So it's not the natural place that it was before, unless you're lucky and they just disturbed right directly where they built your house. Maybe you have an older house. But things like Spanish needle, which I love because the butterflies and all the pollinators love it, but it can be a little weedy. Frog fruit, which in wet places can be a little weedy. White plumbago, which in all can be weedy. Scorpion tail. Down here, gumbo limbos will grow in profusion anywhere you have any. I've got a few in my yard, and I always have bazillions of little babies everywhere. Goldenrod can be a little bit aggressive. It grows from its root. It has rhizomes under the ground, and it kind of makes big patches, and it can get a little bit crazy. You gotta kind of control it sometimes. Wild coffee down here also, the birds love it, so of course they poop it everywhere, and there's little plants everywhere, of course. So to be a weed or not to be a weed, that is the question. Do we think it's a volunteer or do we think it's a weed? I think that if it's okay, and even if you didn't plant it there and you like it, then it's a volunteer and you should leave it and let the birds and butterflies and pollinators all appreciate it, and all the other wildlife that might appreciate it. You might find some of these sorts of weeds for sale, native weedy sort of plants for sale in a nursery. I work with several nurseries, and these are things that we actually do sell on a regular basis. Fleabane, yellow top, which can be a little bit, the clumps can get a little larger maybe than you might like if it's a little moister than you might have thought. Gaillardia, here we have dune sunflower, which can get a little out of control if it's in a moister area. Pencil flower, though you can mow it actually, so I always like to say, hey, just mow it over, and you never know, you can just keep it for the butterflies. And mimosa also, I've tried that a lot in landscapes, and it really just wants to be a lawn for sure. And if you can do that, that's a fantastic thing to do. So what does the research say about weeds? I'm going to leave that one to you. There's so much out there that everybody talks about different kinds of weeds. I left you some resources here. I think actually on page 3 of the handout that I gave to you guys, you'll find there's all these different links to different websites and books, and especially the University of Florida IFAS system, which has tons and tons of information, and there's other organizations for sure that have lots of information. So this ends the academic part of our talk, and now we're going to get on to the practicalities of weeding. So weedikit, the techniques and tools of a proper weeder. Here you go. So this is where you really want to pay attention, though you guys are all going to go, oh, I know that information already, but I'm just kind of gently reminding you of all the good things that you can do by weeding properly. So, and I love this picture, isn't it? It looks like a really comfortable way to weed if you could, right? It's kind of fun. So, the techniques and tools of a successful weeder. So for me, the most important tool that I have for weeding is my eyes. And what I mean by that is I mean being able to see and differentiate and identify weeds as opposed to non-weeds. course, once again, this comes back to what's a weed. So, you know, it's very open for discussion as to what is a weed. It's very much personal, what you think is a weed or not. But really knowing plant ID so you know what you're pulling out, so you don't pull out stuff you do want. You know, if you do want to have volunteers of certain kinds of plants, it makes sense to learn what the seedlings look like when they come up. I have a lot of, especially if you have annual plants and things like that, that you'd like to encourage to reseed in your garden. I would say to you that that is something that you should know what those seedlings look like so you don't accidentally pull them out, or if you do, at least you know what they are so you can replant them, you know, in better places. Also, frankly, really honestly, hand weeding is really probably the most effective form of weeding. It's a little bit more time consuming. It's definitely less expensive. But wear gloves if you need to. Sometimes I feel like wearing gloves is a little bit cumbersome, but definitely wear gloves if you need to. And I also have my handy dandy clippers. Sometimes really stubborn weed, because I really love to pull weeds out, of course, by the roots. So sometimes I will use my clippers to, you know, I'll be pulling the weed up and I'll take my clippers and snip those roots. They're very handy. Also, you can use hose and rakes for things like really large patches of very small weeds, so you can just sort of disturb the top of the soil and get them out pretty quickly. For larger weeds, sometimes we have to actually dig them out, so a trowel or a spade. For grass, you know, if you're grassy weeds, it's like, especially like your actual lawn creeping into your landscape beds, using, if you're good at it, a weed whacker, or preferably an edger to keep a tidy edge is good. And then, of course, some kind of disposal container, whether it's your yard trash bin or a bucket or a bag or whatever you might use. Maybe a wheelbarrow or something like that. So now you've done all this weeding, right? You've been pulling out weeds with by hand. Where do you put them? So a lot of weeds can be put in your composter. It really depends on the weeds. If there's something that's really toxic, or if there's something that is maybe really weedy and reseeds very, very readily, maybe you won't want to put it in your compost, but there's always your yard trash bin. And some weeds that are not toxic, but maybe I'm too, frankly, lazy to put them in my compost or my yard trash bin. I don't really have grass in my walkways. So I will just throw my weeds into my walkways and pathways, and they eventually break down and they're gone very shortly after that. So removal and prevention techniques. So natural methods would be things like hand pulling, which I genuinely feel like is probably the most effective weeding tool that there is, and along with that, using hand tools. If you do want to put berries down, say like in a walkway, or if you're trying to kill some stuff off in a bed or something like that, you can use berries, things like use newspaper and cardboard. You can use straw, mulch. Sometimes I use a combination of those. I'll put down newspaper and or cardboard, and then I'll put some kind of mulchy type thing on top of that. Sometimes, particularly if it's a walkway, I will use landscape fabric, say underneath gravel, so that the gravel doesn't sink down, or even under mulch. But really, I don't really like using fabric, especially not in landscape beds. But in a walkway, you can do it. It's not great for the environment, so it's one of those decisions you got to make. And then we can go to things like chemical weed control. There's many, many varieties, both pre and post emergent. And what I mean is that there are some things that you can buy that can stop weeds from actually sprouting. So those are the kind, it's usually a granule, and you can put it down to kind of stop weed seeds from actually growing. And then of course there's post-emergent weed, chemical weed control, things like Roundup and things like that. Less sod equals less weeds. Lawns are weedy and mowing it makes it worse. And most of the time you can't really control either where the weed, the grass seeds end up going, or the other weed seeds that are in your grass end up going. So I say less sod, more wildflowers. So mulching is one of my favorite things on the planet. It's probably one of the most important weeding techniques that we might have. Mulching helps with so many different things. It helps to regulate soil temperature. It helps to keep the soil moist and keeps the moisture kind of more consistent than if it's directly hit by the sun. And it also, as it breaks down, it provides organic matter to the soil, which of course is nourishing to the soil. Without it, it can make the soil a little bit more exposed to things like erosion from rain and wind. And then also you find that the soil will heat up a little bit more. So especially in the summertime, if you transplanted things and it's very hot, it can really heat up the soil and therefore the roots. So it just, mulch really helps to keep soil temperatures more consistent. And I highly recommend it as a form of helping to control weeds. So types of weed killers, I've got some natural and some chemical methods here. I really prefer using the more natural ones. And as a professional landscaper, I've actually been using a vinegar, salt, soap mix to spray just like wood Roundup. And I just use, literally, you can see here it says vinegar, Epsom salts, and soap. It's that simple and very inexpensive. And particularly on broadleaf plants, not so much on grasses, but on broadleaf plants, especially in bright areas, say like on a driveway or gravel pathway, this can be very effective in just killing the weeds without really having a widespread negative impact on the environment. I've known some people who use also boiling water, especially on driveways and things like that, or on walkways. And also you can use salt. But I really, like I say, I like the vinegar. There's other things I mentioned before, Roundup, pre-emergent granules, weed and feed, which I don't recommend in any way for sure, because one always gets it into their landscape beds and hurts the plants that are in the landscape beds, because it's meant to weed broadleaf plants, not grass. So it's a very not good thing to use. All right, so here's my weed killer recipe. I just mentioned it. You can also add a little citrus oil if you want as well to make it even more strong. But I find that regular vinegar from the grocery store, you can buy horticultural vinegar, but it's really acid and it's just not necessary, and you can burn yourself with that. So why hurt yourself? Just go to the grocery store and get some regular household vinegar, white vinegar, Epsom salts, and some dish soap, and a gallon spray jug. You just put it in there, shake it up, and spray just like you would any other weed killer. So now, getting to the more philosophical side, because nothing is just work. So for me, weeding has a metaphysical and as well as a practical use. So the spiritual and meditative benefits of weeding, so to speak, is really, I mean, it helps you, being that mindful, taking the opportunity to look in your garden that much for all your weeds. It definitely, much like forest bathing, helps to relax us and calm anxiety and those sorts of things. And also, having that mindfulness also has a practical application, and that is that it helps us to get to know our gardens even more. So we recognize when weeding is a problem, or maybe there's bug infestation that needs to be dealt with, or plant that's, you know, ailing and not in good health and needs a little bit of assistance, or maybe has a nutritional deficiency or something like that, that opportunity to be mindful can be very good for both your mind and your garden. I recommend highly planting weeding, especially in Florida where it can be super duper hot, either for early in the morning or like in the afternoon, late in the day, or maybe in the evening, even in the summertime, since it doesn't get dark until quite late. You know, take a glass of wine in the evening and a cup of coffee in the morning and just pitter patter around your garden and pull weeds as you go. You can also think of those weeds as being like annoying people or stressful situations, and just ripping them right out of the ground can help you feel a whole bunch better about it, for sure. Do make it something that's a routine, like a ritual practice that you do, because that's where the mindfulness and knowing what your garden is like and what's going on in your garden, as well as that mental health boost, comes from that sort of like over and over routine. And don't make it too, you know, complicated. Just pull weeds as you drink your whatever, or relax or whatever. You don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a big project. Just allow it to be just a very simple practice that you can actually enjoy, because I actually found that I enjoy it now. I was interested, so I did a little research on gardening therapy and the psychology of why we don't like to weed. First of all, when it becomes a project, or we do it like at not a nice time of the day where we're too hot or whatever, you know, and no matter which way you look at it, if you maybe let it get out of control, it can be kind of time consuming. So that can be a detriment to us getting out there. Maybe just because we're awfully busy, it can be a lack of energy. And also can be a lack of knowledge, like not really knowing which plants are which is why it's good to do that plant ID. Like I said, you know, see the plants, what they are, find out what they are. So you'll start to have knowledge about what's in your own garden, and what's good and what's bad, and etc. Of course, sometimes weeding can be painful, especially if you're not used to bending over or kneeling a lot. But I guarantee you doing it more often definitely makes it more doable, for sure. And I don't know about y'all, but right now, this time of the year, man, it's hot. It's really hot. It's hard to weed. I do it for a living. It's a very hard thing in the heat of the day. And also, I think that some folks have a fear of unknown bugs or critters. I have some friends that, you know, don't like frogs or creepy crawlies or spiders or whatever. So these are some of the reasons why we're not thrilled about weeding. But funnily enough, there is actually an organizational National Horticultural American Horticultural Association. They actually do have not this year, obviously, a National Horticultural Therapy Week. So use your tool. You have a beautiful tool in your yard to help take care of some, especially in these times, our, you know, stress and anxiety, and definitely make use of it. So here we go. Pretty much I'm coming to the end of the show, so to speak, the end of our program. But I just wanted to drop a few more bits of practical weeding wisdom for you. Pull the weeds when they're small, you know, when they're seedlings, before they had a chance to flower and disperse their seeds. And then you'll be doing less weeding. If you can't get to the weeding part before the seeds become viable, just deadhead your plants, trim them back so that, you know, or even before they go to seed, so that you can just leave them there and they're not going to turn into weeds. Do pull your weeds out by the roots. If you don't, most Florida weeds will come back. So it's definitely worthwhile to pull them out by the roots. Using a firm but gentle pressure when you are pulling out your weeds. Don't just yank them out of the ground, because that usually ends up leaving half the roots or half the plant, and then it gets frustrating. be patient with it. Remember, this is a mindful activity. So in order to gain some of that psychological benefit, taking our time and pulling the weeds out, firmly, will reward the weed puller for sure. Also, knowing what kinds of weeds, this kind of goes back to knowing what stuff is. If you know what the weed is before you pull it, you know which technique to use. I mean, some things like grasses can be very difficult. They might have underground rhizomes, might be a vine. So knowing what kinds of different plants you have, you can come up with a better technique or the best technique for doing that kind of weed. And once again, along that therapeutic line, there is no such thing as a weed-free garden, just a weed-controlled garden. So I usually, when I do this at my home. So I actually weed in the morning and in the evening sometimes, depending on how stressful my day was. And I do it a very particular circuit around my yard so I don't miss stuff. Like I have a ritual of how I actually proceed around my yard. And if I stop in one spot, I'll start at that spot the next time I come back. But I know there's no such thing as absolute, no weeds. So knowing that makes me less stressful. And I just keep on plodding away, pulling out them weeds. Removing weeds by hand is always more effective than chemical measures, no matter what it is. And then finally, I leave you with the thought of knowing that you should reclassify weeding as therapy, and it makes it way more fun, especially if you add a glass of coffee in the morning or a glass of whatever in the evening, and turn it into, especially in these times since we have nowhere else to go, into something a little bit more exciting to do. You'll all these different things here is more information about weeding and plant ID and things like that. Go ahead and feel free to look up those websites. You'll see that information is on the handout. A very good friend of mine once gave me a little plaque, and I still have it, and it says, "All my weeds are wildflowers." And that's like how I'd like to leave it for you. But that's it for me on this end. I'm open now for questions. So Melanie, do you have questions?
Yes, we only have one question right now, and I think you may have already answered that. But the question is, which weeding method is most effective at eradicating weeds so they don't reemerge? And I think you may have hit on that.
By the roots.
Yeah.
Getting things out by the roots is really very important. And it's very hard with some things that have like rhizomes, like things like Ruellia, a lot of grasses like torpedo grass and things like that, or even like sedges and things like that. They're very difficult because you might have gotten that one little tuft, but if you didn't get the entire rhizome, that thing's coming back. So it's like one of those things you have to just be consistent as well.
Right. Have another question. Do you have a favorite resource for learning to identify Florida weeds?
You know what? There is a really wonderful one, and I think I have it on. Let me just look and see if I can. Give me 1 second, and I will tell you. The university, Palm Beach State College has, let me see if I can find it on.
Is that, hang on, I'm going to go.
They have a pamphlet. Well, if you, it's Southern, actually it's not on here. So you,
Is that the southern turf grass?
no, that's a good one too. But the one that this one is actually available online for downloading.
Oh, okay.
Florida, I mean, Palm Beach State College. And if you go to their website and you go to their horticulture program, they have a lot of resources on there. And one of those resources is that Weed ID book.
Okay.
It has great pictures. Now, I'm not sure if that's for South Florida only, because I know that definitely up your way.
Yeah, there's
But
definitely
there's a lot of crossover for sure.
right.
So for me, that's probably one of my favorite ones, but also IFAS has a great one. What is the one that, sorry, I haven't looked over this thing. Sorry, I'm not right. You know what? I will look it up so I don't have to waste any time and I will send it to you.
Okay. We have another question. Do you know any strategies for removing perennial peanut from the lawn?
The same as anything else, just consistency. That's going to be the big thing. Like pull it out, give it a week, see what happens. It's going to start coming up, and just being consistent and trying to get out as much of the roots as you possibly can. That's the big thing, because there's really nothing chemical that you can do that's going to be as, I mean, you have to be consistent. That's with most of the weeds that are really persistent. Stuff like sedges and anything with any kind of underground rhizome, rubellias, anything like that, sansevieras. Like it's like you can't just do it and then walk away and think it's going to be okay for even a month. You need to like get back to it like every week for a little while. Like the first part of doing it, you have to be kind of overkill. That's just if you really want to get rid of it,
Right.
So
I guess the other
patience.
alternative, well, the other alternative, because I've had sedge take over my parts of my lawn,
Yeah.
which I struggled with for a long time, and I finally said, okay, I'm just going to accept it.
Yeah. If it's in your lawn, then I mean, this is just me personally. I just let whatever is there grow and I just mow it. And I try not to let it get into my landscape beds.
Yeah.
The places where the grass is supposed to be. That's all like that's the only practical way to do it, or I would spend so much time. Like there's nobody has a perfect lawn unless you rip it all out and then you resod your entire lawn. I mean, once again, I mean, all of these things is there's nothing that is like a quick fix. Sorry. I'd be a millionaire if I had a quick fix.
Anyone else have a question? Okay. It sounds like then we're done.
Okay.
And thank you so much for being here. I will get back in touch with you tomorrow just to wrap things up.
Sure. I will get you some more resources for connections for Weed ID.
Okay. That would be great. Yeah, I've been using the this cooperative extension
Yes.
book for Weed ID. I laugh every time I get to the frog fruit and mimosa pages because those are ground covers that many of us encourage.
Yes. As a landscaper, I do that actually. I have some customers that really want to go all native, and those are the two things, depending on whether it's dry or wet and how sunny it is.
Yeah. With mimosa, how wet does it have to be for that to grow? And because it can be very aggressive, but it can also be stubborn and not spread very much.
Well, I found that in places where it's wetter, oh my God, I had to remove it from someone's place because they actually like natives, but this was so crazy, and we still haven't gotten rid of it like 5 years later. Like it had a root on it that was like 5 feet long,
Wow.
and it was insane. But I found that when it's a drier, more like sandy application, um, you definitely have to initially water it a little more, and it's a little bit thinner. Like, so the more water, the thicker it is, the more aggressive it can be. So the more regular watering it gets, or moister the spot is. I mean, even if it's just regular irrigation, that's, counts too.
Yeah, okay, I got another question here. Do some weeds have a season? So when we see them, we shouldn't freak out and think they'll never disappear.
Um, I mean, there are a few things like down here, we have something called Florida snow. I think you guys have that up there too.
Yeah,
Like, you kind of really see that more in the drier months. It blooms more. I mean, it's a very bad, like, it's very, very weedy, but for me, I kind of like it because all the pollinators like it so much, but it is a non-native species. So, technically, but yeah, I mean, and certainly wildflowers, some wildflowers have, different seasons. Some are fall blooming, some are spring. Some will only do the spring and don't go through the summer. It really just depends on what it is, like things like Dune sunflower and things like that. Pencil flower is perennial, so it kind of stays all the time. But mostly you see the annual stuff for sure. It pops back in and out as depending on the plant itself. But really, spring and fall are the big flower times and the big comeback times for most annuals.
right. Yeah. Yeah, I find it hard to weed in the spring because you can't identify a lot of the seedlings.
That's why it's worth, if you're out in your garden all the time, you kind of start to get to know sort of what the seedlings look like. That's why,
Right.
like, encourage that kind of consistent sort of, regular practice, because then you really do get to know stuff a lot better. And it's better than to control weeds, and also to have, if you do want things to reseed and you don't want to just weed whack them or just pull them out because you don't really know what they are, that gives you the opportunity to do that.
Okay, any other questions? All right, then we're done. Thank you so much, Janine.
You're very welcome.
And thank you everyone who attended.
Have a great evening.